Let me welcome you once again to The Kingdom and the Covenants. This is lesson 4, and tonight we're going to be exploring Genesis chapters 6 through 9, the well-known flood story. And I just want to back up a little bit, though, and say something about what we call the Genesis prologue as a whole. That would be Genesis 1 through 11. So from the beginning of creation through to really the story of Abraham. There are in this prologue two sort of dominating figures. One of them would clearly be Adam. He was to be the steward in God's original creation kingdom. And the second towering figure in these 11 chapters would, of course, be Noah, who is to be God's steward in the new world that emerges after the flood. And so in this lesson, what we're going to do is transition between those two figures. We're going to move from Adam and God's covenantal arrangements with him originally in creation. And then, of course, very graciously after the fall, God was in a covenantal, and I'm using that word advisedly, covenantal relations with Adam and with the whole of creation. The word covenant does not appear there explicitly, but it's a relationship in which God, the Creator King, binds himself to his subjects and to Adam in particular, and binds Adam and his creatures to him in a relationship of love and loyalty. We're going to move from those covenantal relations that God had with Adam and the creation through him to the explicit covenant that God makes with Noah and with all creation through him. And here the word covenant does appear very specifically in chapters 6 and chapter 9. But before we come to Noah, I'd like to just take a minute and say something about this these three chapters, this flood account. Point out three themes. And before I do that, let me just say that underneath where you're viewing the video, you should be able to find class notes, a PDF file of class notes you can pull up and kind of follow along with me and have a sense of where we are. And if you do that, you'll find these three themes that we are going to be talking about kind of throughout our lesson tonight. The first is what I've called dark grace. There's certainly grace in the flood story and the Noah account, but it's kind of dark grace. One purpose of the first 11 chapters of Genesis is to get us ready for Abraham and to show us how badly we need the Savior that God promised when he cursed the serpent in Genesis 3:15. We cannot really grasp what God inaugurates with Abraham and his seed if we don't see how dire the human condition really is. The light that God brings to the world through the Abrahamic covenant will shine brightest when we have this, we would clearly see the dark canvas against which it arises in the first 11 chapters. Gerhardus Voss in his biblical theology says this, and it's in your notes. He says, quote, Revelation bears here, and he's talking about particularly the first 11 chapters, but particularly the Noah story. Revelation here bears, on the whole, a negative rather than a positive character. It contents itself with bestowing a minimum of grace. Had God permitted grace freely to flow out into the world and to gather great strength within a short period, then the true nature and consequences of sin would have been very imperfectly disclosed. Before the work of redemption is further carried out, the downward tendency of sin is clearly illustrated in order that subsequently, in the light of this downgrade movement, the true divine cause of the upward course of redemption might be appreciated, unquote. And that downgrade movement that Voss is talking about really comes to an awful climax in the story of Noah. So dark grace. The second major theme in these chapters is land. The land. It's important for us to begin connecting some dots in these early chapters of Genesis so we don't miss how closely, long before the history of Israel, that's important, long before the history of Israel, we don't want to miss how closely the life of humankind is tied to the material world, to the ground or land or earth out of which man was formed. And you can sort of see these dots if you've been following along in these studies. Adam's origins are from the soil. His sin results in God's curse on what? On the ground in chapter 3, verse 17. Then he and Eve are expelled from the land that God gave them to cultivate and to keep, even as they are sent out to work the ground outside the garden. Then the blood of Abel in chapter 4 cries out from the ground after Cain kills him. That sin affects the ground. Noah's father, Lamech, looks for relief from God's curse he says, out of the ground that the Lord God has cursed in chapter 5, verse 29. And then now in the story of Noah, we find in chapter 6, verse 7, that humankind is about to be blotted out, quote, from the face of the land. That is very specifically underscored. So dark grace here, grace, but it's dark grace. Land is important here again. And finally, seed. We are once again tracing the two seeds we've been tracing since Genesis 3:15. And that helps explain what would otherwise, I think, be a very puzzling opening line in the Noah story. We're talking about the seeds, the two seeds again. And that brings us to the opening verses of chapter 6. I want to talk for a minute here about the antediluvian world, the pre-flood world. And in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 6, we see what I think is best described as a mingling of the two seeds that God identified and in a very real sense separated and put at enmity with each other in chapter 3, verse 15. That curse on the serpent sets up everything that follows in Genesis. It sets up the two seeds. And we've seen in the story of Cain and later the story of Seth and his children that genealogical distinction, that seed distinction, the genealogical distinction took geographical form in the pre-flood world. Because Cain, one line of seed, went out from God's presence. There was a geographic separation of the two lines of seed. And thereafter, we saw the formation of two different cultures, two different ways of life. The Cainites thrived culturally while they degenerated morally, maybe sort of symbolized in their naming their cities after themselves in chapter 3, verse 17. On the other side of the geographic divide, the Sethites were people who called on the name of the covenant Lord, who walked with God like Enoch, and who looked for God's salvation to be worked out in the world like Noah's father Lamech. And they didn't name their cities after themselves. We don't know that they built any cities. They named themselves after the Lord. They called upon the name of the Lord. And then we come to chapter 6, and things end up not being quite so tidy. It's not quite as neat as two lines of seed geographically separated. As the population in the pre-flood world exploded, and I'm not a demographics expert by any means, but I've read some things that have suggested that the population of the world before the flood may have exploded to extraordinarily large numbers. And as that happened, of course, it's natural that the geographic distance would have closed, more people living closer together. And the sons of God, we're told here in verse 2 of chapter 6, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were lovely to behold. They were desirable. You might hear echoes there of Genesis 3:6 as the woman, Eve, is looking on the tree, and it's desirable, and it's lovely to behold. And they start taking wives from among the daughters of men. Now, there's a theory that you might sometimes hear that perhaps these quote-unquote sons of God were angels who came down and in some way mated with humankind. I don't think that can really be squared with God's response to this mingling. In chapter 6, verse 3, we're told that God's spirit will not strive with Ha-Adam because he is flesh. So it seems that God, what God targets here as the sinners in this scenario are Ha-Adam. They are fleshly, not angelic or spirits. And he later determines that he's going to blot out Ha-Adam. He's going to blot humankind off of the face of the earth. And there's no reference there to angels at all. So I think that theory just doesn't hold up very well with what follows here in the text. In the context, I think it's best to read the sons of God as the line of seed in which God's image is clearly identified. Back in chapter 5, we read this. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them Adam when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. So there's a kind of parallel between the sons of Adam who bear his image and the sons of God who bear his image. And I think that it's best here to see these sons as the people who, the Sethites, who follow God, who are most clearly, by their faith and righteousness, continuing to bear his image in the world even as sinners. It is they who intermarry with either Cainite women or perhaps with unfaithful Sethite women. And to all appearances, as chapter 6 unfolds, this union is genetically and culturally highly productive. It produces a race of almost supermen, what are called the Gibborim here, political, economic, cultural, and technological titans, mighty in the earth. These were, at the end of chapter 6, verse 4, these were the mighty men who were of old, the Gibborim, the men of renown. They are powerful. They are culturally very advanced, much as the great grandchildren of Cain were culturally quite advanced. But from the divine perspective, as much as this seems like it's culturally very productive, this union, from the divine perspective, of course, this is disastrous and is very wicked. And so we find in verses 5 through 7 this gathering storm as God begins to respond to this. And what God sees among the Gibborim is that for all of its cultural fertility and grandeur, there is not a Godward impulse in this entire civilization. Very sobering words. Every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. That's what God sees. And just as in the Cainite Lamech's family, Lamech the murderer, Lamech who boasted of his murdering, who took multiple wives, and so on. The direction of everything now in this mingled culture is toward rebellion against God, towards what we call autonomy, human beings seeking to rule themselves with no reference to God. The direction is toward moral degeneracy and violence. We are told the earth was filled with violence in verse 11 of chapter 6. And even the sons of God now have been swept up in this current of rebellion and immorality through their intermarriage. The salt has desperately lost its savor. And the portrayal of God's grief in response to this is very moving, I think. Once again, we don't have this raging deity smashing his enemies. There is actually a description here of grief, that it grieved God at his heart that he had made man. I mean, this takes us into an area where God is speaking of his response in human terms, in terms that we can relate to, terms that reflect what we would think of as human emotions. There is grief here, and this expresses that God's response to sin is not just revulsion at evil in the infinite purity of his character, but there's also here a reflection of his great love for humankind. He loves his human creatures, and he loves their reflection of his image in the world, and his response to this is sorrow, as the Bible describes it here. And he will not settle for mere containment of the evil, as in chapter 3, his spirit will not always strive, and the days of fleshly man shall be 120 years. God is not content to settle for containment here. He vows that he will assert his sovereign lordship by destroying the world, including the animals in verse 7 here, reminding us again that the fate of all creation stands or falls on the fate of humanity. But against that horrible dark background, in verses 8 and 9, something emerges here explicitly for the first time. The word grace is used in verse 8. And it is such a big deal that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord that this launches a new toledot. I've mentioned to you before that the Hebrew word for generations, toledot, is a word that every time you see these are the generations of in Genesis, that's setting up another section of the book. The whole book is structured around these toledot. And so in verse 9 we have, these are the toledot, or the generations now, of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. There's a whole new chapter in the story that begins with this grace and favor of God to this righteous man. Now, one of the things that's very, very important here is that as we look at the life of Noah, we get some important insight into what qualifies a person to be described as righteous and blameless. He was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. And it's interesting how often Christians are very uncomfortable saying, I am a righteous man, or I am a blameless woman. There's something about that seems maybe pretentious, or maybe doesn't take our sin seriously, or somehow is kind of exalting ourself in a way that We don't have a right to. And I think Noah helps us with that we should speak of ourselves as righteous. We should speak of ourselves as blameless. God speaks of Noah this way, and it's not that he's sinless. What is very interesting is that after the flood, in chapter 8, verse 21, God smells this sweet aroma of Noah's sacrifices, and he says, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Now that's after the flood. Man's heart is evil from his youth. That's still true after the flood. That's true of Noah and his sons, as much as it was true of the Gibborim before the flood. And you have in your notes there, William Dumbrell has a quote that has really many times stood out to me as I've thought about this over the years. He says, quote, in his book, Covenant and Creation, quote, the reference to the heart of man in Genesis 8:21, which remains unchanged by the experience of the flood, parenthetically, the flood didn't change human sin. That reference, he says, refers initially to the 8 who have been saved, and thus throws into clear relief the nature of Noah's righteousness as something extrinsic to him, which is to say, he has that righteousness which God gives to his people as a gift as they come to him as sinners in the way that God has appointed for sinners to come. And that's true of Noah. Noah believes in the proto-evangelium that the Latin term we've used to describe Genesis 3:15, the first gospel, the proto-evangelium. He believes that promise of the coming Savior, as Adam and Eve believed that promise. And he believes God's later covenant promise to him in particular, as God says in chapter 6, verse 18, I will establish my covenant with you. Noah believes that gracious word from the Lord, and an indicator that he knows he needs this coming Savior, and that he trusts in the covenant Lord to provide that Savior as one who will be some kind of substitute in his place. I think that is one indicator of that is the blood sacrifices that as I just said, he offers after the flood in chapter 8, verse 20. Like Abel before him, he understands something of what substitutionary sacrifice means. Someone dying in his place. We'll come back to that. So Noah is fundamentally here a man of faith, a man with confidence in God's grace, confidence in God's covenant promises, confidence in the sacrifices that mediate between sinners and God. And out of that faith, he responds faithfully to God's promises and also to God's commands. He's obedient because he is a man of faith, as a man of what we might, as a man we might describe as a man of Sabbath or worship, surrounded by so much godless dominion taking. He's a man of Sabbath in the midst of all that godless work. And because he's a man of Sabbath, he's also a man of stewardship. He's a man who, because of his worship, can be a man who devotes himself to righteous work. And then, of course, as the story unfolds, through his faith and his faithfulness, his household and even the lower inhabitants of the world end up being saved. And that faith moves him to a bizarre building project there in verses 11 through 22 of chapter 6. Because Noah believes things that the godless regard as crazy, he is able to do things that they regard as crazy. He builds this enormous boat, dimensions something like 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet, somewhere around 100,000 square feet of deck. There really hadn't been rain up to this point. The whole reason for building this boat is sort of a laughing stock, but he is deaf to the laughter of the godless, and he becomes in his generation what the Apostle Peter in his second letter calls a herald of righteousness. He is proclaiming the righteousness of God and the way of salvation in the ark in his generation because he knows and he trusts this living God. He is a man who walks by faith in as yet unseen things. He does not merely live by sight. And if you think he's a fool, his floating zoo is going to enter into this world to come on the other side of the flood while the mightiest cities of the Gibborim are washed away and destroyed. And that does bring us then to the flood in chapter 7. Chapter 7 begins with the sovereignty of God in the first 10 verses. As in creation, so here in decreation, God speaks as the absolutely sovereign Lord. That is just assumed here in the story. It is his sovereign will that humankind has so violently and wickedly rebelled against, and by his will, because he speaks and it is done, the earth is going to be cleansed. But this will not be at the expense of his original creation purposes. The Lord of judgment has not given up on his purposes as Lord of creation, and the offspring of every living creature will be kept alive on the face of all the earth. It says there in chapter 7, verse 3, God's justice here is for love's sake. Even his justice has this deep intent of restoring the purposes for which he made the world and humankind in particular. The sovereignty of God, and in verses 11 through 16 of chapter 7, the suddenness of judgment. For those who have ignored God's long witness over the decades through Noah, this judgment, as it suddenly springs up here in this story, it is an unexpected judgment. It is a swift, and as I said, it is a sudden judgment. What once would have seemed like a myth to these people listening to Noah arrives with devastating and irresistible power there in verse 11. Much as Jesus says later, the coming of the Son of Man will be to the inhabitants of the earth. And what follows there and following in verse 11 is a throwback to the original first verses of Genesis. There's language here that definitely is hearkening back very consciously to what happened in the opening chapter of Genesis, only now it's in reverse. Because the fountain of the deep, there in verse 11, the fountain of the deep, in Hebrew it's Tehom. The fountains of the Tehom burst forth, and that is the same word we saw in Genesis 1 verse 2, darkness was upon the face of the watery Tehom. In the beginning, God gave the breath of life to all creatures, Genesis chapter 1. Here, that breath of life is extinguished. Every creature in which is the breath of life, verse 15, is destroyed. In Genesis 1, God parted the waters, separating waters from waters, and now the waters burst forth from below as the fountains break open and the waters rain down in rivers from on high. And once again, William Dumbrell describes this in very powerful language. He says, quote, the basic distinction between heaven and earth, effected by Genesis 1, 6 through 8, is obliterated. The windows of heaven open to bring this about, together with the other disturbing phenomena which chapter 7 verse 11 reports. This brings a deluge of such magnitude that it progressively engulfs the earth, then affects birds, cattle, swarming creatures, and finally all men. By this order, which reverses the original creation pattern, the world is effectively put back into the Genesis 1:1 situation, unquote. I think that is brilliantly said. This is decreation. It is the full undoing, it seems, of everything that emerged from that watery, dark, unformed, unfilled Tehom in Genesis 1 and Genesis 1 verses 1 and 2. But so that even as the earth, in that original creative act of God, the earth was originally unformed and unfilled in the beginning, so and God's Spirit was moving over the surface of the waters there in Genesis 1 verse 2. And that's really what we have here again, isn't it? We're in the same situation. The earth is once again unformed and unfilled, with only God's Spirit and a tiny little ark moving over the surface of the waters. And that brings us to verses 17 through 24, just the security of grace. Above the awful death toll here, it is shocking, it is horrifying, the death toll. Every living creature has perished, an image of the sinfulness of sin and the certainty of God's judgment upon sin. But above that awful death toll, there rides this little seed of a new humanity and of a new world made possible by grace alone. And with that, we open chapter 8. And there's something here in the beginning of chapter 8. As the flood waters, the rain has stopped, but the flood waters prevail over the face of all the earth. There's this deathly stillness. And I want you to feel that as this chapter opens. The creation has been reversed. God's wonderful world, his creation kingdom, has been drowned. And life on this ark is not sustainable. I mean, this is a short-term proposition we have going here. And for about 5 months, in that deathly stillness, everything in creation hangs on the single thread of a promise. God said he would establish his covenant with Noah. And then, in verse 1 of chapter 8, God causes a ruach in the Hebrew, a ruach, a wind, or a spirit. And it begins to stir on the face of the waters, and a new creation begins, even as the Ruach moved over the face of the waters in the beginning. God has remembered his promise. And he begins to put the waters back in their place. Job describes this in chapter 38 of his, Job 38, 8 through 11. Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I, God is speaking here, when I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. God begins to put the sea back where he wants it to belong. While the new creation comes forth surely, however, and it does, it also comes forth very slowly, doesn't it? Patience will be required. First, there's this bump in chapter 8, verse 4, this bump on the mountains of Ararat. Months later, the mountaintops are finally visible in verse 5. Months more go by as various birds are sent out to investigate. And even after the last bird is sent and finds a place to land, there are still 2 months more of waiting. God did not create instantaneously, and he doesn't recreate instantaneously. The times and the seasons of his creative work are in his hand. They are known only to him. And what he is looking for in this long, slow process is faith and faithfulness under his word, under his good covenant word. At every point along the way, he's looking for faith and for faithfulness. None of those who trust in him will ultimately be disappointed, but things will take time. I think that is something we do well to bear in mind in our own time when, after the ascension of Jesus, the Ruach of Christ, the Spirit of Christ, is moving now over the sea of all peoples. The peoples of the world are described as a sea many places in the Bible, and the Ruach is moving over those waters, but it takes time. And what happens when the door of the ark finally opens to this new world is crucially important. The very first activity you see there at the end of chapter 8, the very first human activity is worship, centered on olah offerings, burnt offerings, which signify 2 things. These burnt offerings signify, number 1, that life in this new world belongs to God who created it and who has so graciously now preserved it. The olah offerings, the burnt offerings, later in the time of Moses, they were particularly used to express the offering up of the life of the worshiper to God. And here there is this symbolizing in this sacrificial offering that the life of God's creatures belongs to him, and it is offered up to him. He has graciously created and preserved this life, and it belongs to him. And the olah offering signifies that sinners, because Noah and his family are sinners, they can live in this world as God intended human beings to live. By that we mean they can live as God intended humans to live, in communion with him and with each other. We've talked about communion, taking dominion over the earth, fulfilling their mission to fill the earth with his glory. We've talked about these 3 major elements of human life that we're made for: communion, for dominion, and for mission. But human beings can only, as sinners, can only fulfill all of those purposes that God has for his human creatures. They can only do that if God provides an atoning sacrifice. It is as if Noah and his family are saying, in this substitutionary sacrifice, we offer up our lives to God. Through blood, through the bloody sacrifice, our substitute killed for us, we offer up our lives to God as his. And in response to these sacrifices in verses 21 and 22, which, I think this is important, these sacrifices of Noah, which link up, if you remember, with the sacrifice that clothed Adam and Eve. These sacrifices link up with that sacrifice that clothed them. It links up with Abel's offering that was acceptable to God. And these sacrifices here with the Noah offers, they link up as well with the whole sacrificial system which is yet to come under Moses, who is writing this account of the flood. There's a long kind of chain that is being woven here, and this is one link in the chain. In response to these sacrifices that link up to all of that, God promises now that despite human sin, he will preserve the earth and the human race from this time on. And that brings us to the specific conditions then of this covenant, which has been called the covenant of preservation. I think that's a fine term, or the common grace covenant, because it will extend to all creatures, not merely to those who are believers in God and walk in faith and faithfulness with him. The specific conditions of this Noahic covenant, or this covenant of preservation, A covenant of preservation which is made possible by the foundational reality of redeeming grace. That's what these sacrifices tell us. But the specific conditions then of this covenant of preservation in particular, ultimately resting on the foundation of God's redeeming grace, those conditions are spelled out in chapter 9. And with that, we will finish. The Noahic covenant is spelled out in the very opening verses of chapter 9. And the first thing we see here is that it is still God's intention that human beings be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's what he says there in verse 1. And that language should ring very familiar to us from Genesis chapter 1, because that's what God originally wanted human beings to be and to do, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And that connects then God's plans in preserving the human race to his plans in creating them in the beginning. That's the first thing we see, this connection between preservation and creation. The second thing we see is that human beings will continue to have dominion. But in verses 2 through 6, given the propensity, which we've seen, that resulted in the flood, that was the reason for the flood, given the propensity of sinners for violence in their dominion taking, God imposes here certain boundaries or limits on dominion taking. For example, man may now hunt animals to eat them, but he is required to show respect for their life by not eating their blood. The life of the flesh is in the blood. You're to show respect for the life of this creature by not ravenously devouring its blood and sort of consuming it raw. And if man is to refrain from bloodthirsty violence towards animals, how much more toward his fellow men? In fact, not only must human violence against the lives of other human beings be avenged, God says here, but even animal violence against human life must be avenged. From every beast, God says, I will require the life of man. And all of that foreshadows certain precepts that will be stated explicitly in the law of Moses when we come to that in time. Thirdly, even in empowering human beings to avenge violence, to avenge bloodshed, even in empowering that avenging function of the human community, God restrains his own judgment of sin in verses 8 through 17. Graciously, unilaterally, not at any invitation from Noah, just out of his own heart and mind, God binds himself in covenant to every living creature and even to the earth itself. I will never again cause the waters to become a flood to destroy the earth. And in the beautiful sign that God places in the cloud, that very place from which his judgment fell in watery rivers, he places a beautiful sign in the cloud. And in that sign, you'll notice it is a bow, and God's mighty war bow, as it were, is not taut, it's not bent, not battle ready, but it's in the relaxed position. God is not at war to destroy all human beings with another flood. He is waiting, not for humans to change. Their hearts remain evil from youth. He's waiting for what? He's waiting for his glorious plan of redemption to fully run its course. It's so important to emphasize this. Preservation is for redemption. It sets a stage on which God's plan of redemption can be acted out. Without that preserving grace, the entire plan of God to redeem the human race would be continually imperiled pretty much every generation. Gerhardus Voss says it well. He says, quote, because the evil is thus deep-seated, referring there to human evil in the heart, no judgment can cure it. Therefore, other means must be resorted to, and these other means would become impossible of execution if repeated catastrophic judgments of this nature in the sequel interfered with the ordinary unfolding of history, unquote. In other words, if God was destroying humankind every generation or so, there would never be an opportunity for redemption to unfold. And while this, what might appear here to be a kind of divine softness on sin is actually a manifestation of God's extraordinary, patient kindness that desires and is determined to bring about the salvation of his human race. Peter says this in 2 Peter 3, 7 through 9. But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and the destruction of the ungodly. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. It is the kindness of God to wait until his plans of redemption have fully unfolded. And when that great work of redeeming the human race has been fulfilled, then and only then will the entire heavens and earth be cleansed for the last time, and everything that God has preserved, every creature that God has preserved, will then experience the fullness of redemption. Paul says in Romans 8, 19 through 21, the creation itself then will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. All of creation will join us as the fullness of God's children have been redeemed. And that too, Peter goes on to describe there in that third chapter of his second letter. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn? But according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. And until that day comes, God will preserve all things for the purposes of his redeeming grace. And the next step from where Noah is standing, the next step in the redemption plan will very shortly arrive in the call of a Shemite named Abram. We'll come to that, but first we're going to spend some time with the sons of Noah next time as we unpack the last part of the prologue in Genesis 9 through 11. I look forward to seeing you then.